I just want to begin with you, Alison. It's been a challenging couple of years for M&A after the boom period we saw in 21. What do you think is the current state of affairs, and are you seeing a recovery in the market globally?
So we've definitely seen a pickup since the beginning of this year, a meaningful pickup now, all but from a very, very low base, and we're still nowhere near the highs, and I don't think we will be for a long time, of 21. That pickup is mostly in the US and in Europe, not in APAC. APAC is actually down in volume terms. It's a lot more being driven by corporate transactions versus private equity, financial investor transactions. But it is a very, very real pickup. I think volumes are 30 to 40% plus up. We're also seeing some quite aggressive behavior for the first time, I think, in a while. You saw obviously the BHP Anglo transaction, which was clearly unsolicited. You've seen similar with banks in Spain. And we've seen some interlopers come into transactions. So I do think it feels like we're getting back to a place where M&A bankers are a lot busier and a lot happier, all but, from a very low point.
Okay, and do you think the activity for the rest of the year remains pretty skewed on the corporate side of stuff?
Yes, I think everybody's sitting and waiting for when do the private equity come back into the market in a meaningful way. They're not there, but the activity is very definitely down versus where it has been. I think we see a bit of a backlog of sell sides, particularly in Europe, coming out of private equity that probably need to happen first of all. And then, of course, as you get towards the end of the year, we've got big elections, US and the UK. My expectation is that will impact activity a little bit. It doesn't always, but it does in some times when they happen. And I think this year these elections are so meaningful, although I think people feel the UK is kind of done actually, that actually people will pause. And if they're thinking about big transactions, they'll just wait and see how that pans out first.
Thank you. And May, I just want to bring the Middle East into this context, and you've been a practitioner of M&A like in the Middle East for many years now. Can you give us a broad overview of how M&A has evolved in this region over the last decade or so, and what have been the kind of drivers to M&A what we're seeing here today?
Sure, pleasure to be here, thank you. Look, I would say that over the past handful of years or 10 years, we're seeing a bit of a shift in the way that M&A has worked. Historically, we saw the vast majority of capital being deployed from this region to invest outside, particularly sovereign wealth funds putting funds behind private equity firms for them to invest ultimately. And now we're seeing them be a lot more proactive, and not just in sovereign wealth funds directly, but also in the GRE. So a lot of the companies that are owned by the sovereign wealth funds are themselves being very active and proactive. You've seen Aramco making big acquisitions in Petrochem. You've seen ADNOC acquiring Fertiglobe as well. You're seeing STC and Etisalat taking stakes in the likes of Vodafone and Telefonica. And these are all multi-billion-dollar transactions. They're not small by any stretch. They're certainly coming in and being quite aggressive in that. And what's happening with all of that is driving, if you will, it's a domestic agenda that's being driven by all of this and trying to diversify away from their core historical oil and gas sector. And we're not going to see that dissipating anytime soon. We're expecting to see that volume of activity growing, and that translating itself into also the private sector being quite acquisitive at the same time. The last thing I would say is we're also seeing consolidation happening in the banking sector. We've seen that happen over the past number of years. Mostly the domestic, the consolidation in the banking sector is happening within a country. We still haven't seen it happening across borders, but we're seeing that consolidation starting, and I think we expect that to continue to take place as well.
And Tara, when you talk about the M&A market in the region, it's obviously evolved over a period of time. How do you compare the market here on the level of sophistication, the quality of dialogue you have with your clients to probably other markets globally, and how do you think that has changed?
So, look, the market has definitely matured over the last decade. The conversations are highly sophisticated. I mean, historically, the region has always been viewed as a provider of capital. And it was, just the capital and nothing else, really. But that's changed completely. It's shifted completely. The agendas of the sovereign wealth funds and the governments in the region around diversification from hydrocarbons hasn't shifted, but the approach has shifted. So the dialogues are highly sophisticated. Most of the sovereign wealth funds are, have people who are ex-bankers, ex-consultants, global expats with a lot of experience behind them. And so the counterpart that you're facing is highly sophisticated now, are actually market practitioners. So the dialogue has really become much more sophisticated than it was historically.
And does that mean that when you cover the region, you also need to be more aware of what is happening outside the region today?
Absolutely.
And coordinate better with your colleagues in other parts of the world?
Absolutely. I mean, again, the approach for the different sovereign wealth funds is different. There are obviously those that are focused globally, looking at the US and looking at Asia. And then in that instance, they want to hear directly from people on the ground, sector experts, regional experts. And the onus on us in the region is to bring all of that, capability to bear for clients in the region. On the other hand, there are sovereign wealth funds that are very focused on the region. So if you look at the trend of M&A activity in the last couple of years, obviously 2023, there was a lot more cross-border, outbound M&A activity. But 2021 and 2022 in particular, most of the M&A deal volume consisted of intra-regional and in-market deal activity in the Middle East. So there's a lot of activity that's happening on the ground. And for that as well, you need sector experts, practitioners in your own shops to bring them to have these conversations around the region.
Okay. Alison, when you are, have a global remit covering M&A across industries, how much of Middle East institutions and the capital, how much of that comes up in your dialogues these days? How important is this region for someone who's sitting in London or New York?
I think it's definitely far more important than it was. And that's become ever more so probably in the past 2 or 3 years. I think there've been transactions rumoured that may or may not have happened coming out of this part of the world that have really surprised people in terms of size and scale. And what that has meant is it's meant that a lot of bankers have been getting on planes and coming over here, putting ideas in front of people, and just fueling a lot more of that engagement that you spoke about. So I don't think we have a conversation, particularly a conversation which involves, a large asset with, a bunch of private equity investors or whatever, where you're not thinking somewhere about money coming in from the Middle East for part of that. What we're not seeing a lot of is we're not seeing a lot of large controlled transactions by corporates coming out of this part of the world into Europe, APAC, or the US yet. Yeah. We talk about it a lot, but we're not actually seeing it happening yet.
Do you think that's going to change in due course? Do you think there's an ambition there to kind of do large?
I actually do, and part of it is, again, going back to the whole push that the region has on itself, which is, I think, a dramatic difference from what we've seen previously. And what's happening is that these corporations that are owned, or companies that are either owned by governments or owned by the private sector, are thinking about how do they make themselves relevant in an IPO story? How do they make themselves relevant in a global world as well? And so M&A becomes an incredibly important factor in all of this, because you do need to create an equity story that attracts international investors coming into that. So when you look at, for example, some of the ADNOC acquisitions that they're doing. Yeah. They're acquiring holistically companies, and they are diversifying away a little bit and adding more into the different subsegments of what exists within the whole ADNOC universe. We're seeing something similar happening in some of the ADQ portfolio companies, as an example, and we're certainly seeing it happening with some of the companies that Saudi and PIF are encouraging and promoting. So I do think that we're going to start seeing more majority acquisitions that are taking place. We're seeing some of them now. There's a lot that's currently in the works as well. Some have had successes, some have had failures. But I do think that the direction of travel is to continue to go down the path of that diversification that will allow with it more meaningful acquisitions that will then domicile their headquarters or domicile their existence within the confines of what exists within the region. So I do think that we're going to see a lot more of that activity.
Okay. And Tara, when you think about going to these institutions today, which, as Alison mentioned, flooded with ideas from different parts of the world, how do you prioritize? How do you ensure that their time is put to good use, your time is good to put to use? Are there any specific areas or geographies where you think there's a bit more priority when it comes to deal making?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think how do you prioritize? I think you need to know your client. I think they're pretty transparent about where they're spending time, the sectors they're interested in, the regions they're interested in. A lot of the dialogue we're having currently is around Asia. That's been the case, I think, at least for the last 12 to 18 months. I think part of that is driven by the fact that, capital from the United States obviously dried up for China specifically. And so that obviously opened up an opportunity for sovereign wealth funds in the region to spend more time and see if there were opportunities for them to explore there. So a lot of dialogue around APAC and Asia more broadly. The US continues to be relevant and important for our part of the world, I think, especially when it pertains to sectors like AI or semiconductors or technology. There are a lot of conversations around that, and the US is seen as a thought leader in that space. So I think the agendas are pretty clearly laid out. A lot of these sovereign wealth funds, like I said, are also highly sophisticated. So they've been building thesis around certain sectors or subsectors for many, many years now, and you've already seen them invest in companies globally. So in a lot of instances, it's about actually using those portfolio companies to further invest or grow, grow within that space.
Okay. Alison, you briefly touched upon elections. I mean, we are heading to a year when all major economies seems to be heading to polls or already getting there. How is that broadly impacting deal activity? I think you touched upon it early, but can you elaborate? How are you thinking when you, when do you pitch to clients and when you think about transactions?
Look, I think, and this is not just an M&A comment, I think it's more broader.
Yeah.
I think what we're expecting that this half of the year is front-loaded in terms of activity.
Okay.
And that some of that activity you've seen, across particularly some of the financing products, as well as M&A, is happening sooner rather than later. And my expectation would be, as we get towards kind of October-ish time, post-summer, things will just start to cool down. Now, that doesn't mean they'll cool down in terms of the work that we would be doing, because, there's a huge amount of preparation that goes into a lot of these transactions, so you'll be preparing for things to come out post. But I would imagine in terms of announcements, activity will just slow a bit, because I do think, there is a huge amount of volatility in the world regardless of these elections, right? And I think the combination of them at this moment in time just means there'll be a little bit of a slowdown. I don't think it's a prolonged slowdown, by the way. I just think it's in that 3 or 4 months running up to an election and the output of it, assuming that that's a quick output, by the way. Yeah. And then I think hopefully things will pick up and be a little bit more steady from that point onwards.
But it's an interesting point. Just picking up from that, though, as it pertains to the Middle East, It was interesting yesterday to hear the Prime Minister of Qatar make a comment, because he was asked a similar question about what he thinks the impact of the elections, in India and the United States and the UK is going to mean for the region. And I thought his answer was, quite an interesting one, and I agree with it. As far as the foreign policy of these countries towards the Middle East is concerned, his statement was he doesn't think that that's going to change dramatically, no matter what the result of these elections is. So, hopefully, at least for the Middle East, I hope that means that activity is going to continue at a pace, and we're not going to get distracted by that.
Yeah. It almost feels like there's been a bit of a contrast in the Middle East to the rest of the world. Seems like people been generally a bit more busy here when it comes to transactions. And M&A is a volatile business, as we all know, but I want to hear from you, May. Do you think this is here to stay, in this region? When you think about long term, do you think that, we are at this stage in the Middle East where you would assume that, the transaction activity you're seeing will continue for a long period of time?
I mean, we're incredibly busy. And I would say, maybe I'd compare it towards a teenager that's becoming an adult, so to speak, right? There was a lot of growth that's happening over here, and I'm particularly focused on the fact that there is a domestic agenda. I think that makes a huge difference in the place of M&A here to stay question. Yeah. When you look at what Saudi is trying to do, and it's a Herculean effort, what they're trying to do in terms of completely changing their economy and diversifying their economy. M&A will have to factor into that, and we're seeing it. We're seeing even in Saudi investing in Lucid in order to get Lucid to come and put a manufacturing facility or Savvy acquiring Scopely for $3.9 billion, or some of the other initiatives that are taking place. Ultimately, the whole concept of M&A that we're seeing a lot of activity in is in the reconstituting the diversification plan that the sovereigns or the governments are trying to do within their own domestic agenda. That is not going to change anytime soon, because if they don't do that, they will run the risk of what happens in the next generation when oil is not as relevant anymore. So I do think that M&A will continue to be very much featured in that. The one thing that I would also say, it's not all tailwinds, there's some headwinds. And the headwinds are coming from the fact that we're seeing globally lots of governments having, if you want, fears of what M&A can bring to its own national security and national agenda. And I think that's very politically and geopolitically driven. So as an example, we're seeing where Redbird IMI tried to buy Telegraph. That was stopped by the UK government. We saw when G42 was first trying to do activity in the US, they were told, well, you're not necessarily going to be that welcome here if you have such dramatic Chinese ties. Sever those ties, and they had to publicly sever those ties. And the next thing you hear is then Microsoft put in $1.5 billion into G42. So the political angles are going to continue to drive some direction in M&A in our part of the world as well, because of sheer fact of where the whole world sits within either hot wars or cold wars, which are driving a bit of that.
And Tara, it's almost like an evolving market almost literally every day. Like you have new entities who pop up who have like lots of money, like G42, good example.
Great, yeah. Keep them coming.
The more the merrier.
Absolutely.
You got Lunette, and you got the semiconductor venture in Saudi Arabia. Is it kind of like for bankers kind of becoming a bit difficult to even think about where you're going to spend your time?
Look, the people are not changing.
Yes.
Sure, there are new entities, new organizations, but people are moving around. It's the same ecosystem. With people coming out of ADQ going into Lunate, people at Alat who have come out of maybe other organizations, etc. So we know the people, and again, it's a case of understanding what the agendas are and what they want to do, and really spending time with them. But to your previous question, I agree with May. I mean, the Saudi Vision 2030, Qatar National Vision 2030, we the UAE 2031, 6 years away, right?
Yeah.
I just don't see the governments kind of slowing down and the GREs slowing down, because there's a lot to be done in the next 6 years in terms of execution. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of these new entities, etc., setting up is in a way of an attempt to accelerate that path to these agendas.
Yeah, I agree.
And Alison, we talked about headwinds in the Middle East. I mean, we've had few headwinds globally on M&A, like whether it was the financing markets, which kind of shut down briefly, valuation discrepancies, and are they still all existent, or where do you think we are currently with that?
I think they're all still existing, but it always depends on your perspective. So we're very definitely, I think, seeing a gap between the bid-ask spread around assets, right? And that has caused a lot of auction processes to be pulled back. It's caused a lot of deals to falter and not even get to the public domain. I think we're also seeing, what we're seeing among the corporates, particularly the listed corporates, is the reality of much more acceptance of where valuations are versus a couple of years ago. And that factoring into a lot of the deal activity that we're beginning to see. But what we're not seeing is this sort of huge logjam of assets pouring out of private equity that at some point you would expect to see. And I think there's a lot more sensitivity to the belief that they can kind of hold on and live through until valuations are just back. And there are obviously different schools of thoughts on when that will be and if that will happen.
And how about geopolitics? I mean, it seems like every regulator is getting a bit more stringent when it comes to M&A. How do you kind of make deals more palatable in this environment?
Look, I think it's become, you've seen, national interest walls go up in pretty much every country around the world, really since COVID. They haven't come back down. None of them seem to be moving back down. You've seen, particularly in the US, I think a huge amount of uncertainty as to, in certain, large deals where there could be problems, and some, I think, noise coming out of that part of the world in terms of how they'll look at, even private equity firms consolidating sectors and much narrower views. So, look, I think you need to go in eyes wide open, right? I don't think any M&A banker and lawyers and clients go in saying, we're going to put a deal in front of them that we don't think we're going to get done, right? When you're seeing these deals, you think they're going to get done and you think you're going to be able to find a solution. But that, I think, it's just become a little bit trickier, and it's ever changing, and you have to navigate it. Yeah.
And from a point of view of the region, you mentioned how there were some deals which got looked at. I mean, are you becoming more and more aware, of the sensitivities which regarding regulation? Tara, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, look, from my perspective, regulation has always been there, right? And regulation is not new. From a M&A practitioner perspective, we're always having to navigate that. But, as Alison says, it's evolving. It's certainly in the last couple of years has become more difficult, as I think, the kind of national levels of nationalism and nationalistic outlook has definitely increased. But I think, when there's a clear strategic rationale for a deal, I think, of course, you need to navigate it, but, they usually get done, or they get done with remedies, right? So, it's the art of navigating these processes. But I don't know what you think.
Yeah, and I want to clarify one point that I said earlier. It's not that I was suggesting that these types of issues are against our region. I think it's just in general around the world we're seeing a lot more nationalistic views, particularly when a lot of these geopolitical agendas are being played out, and we're seeing that play out not just in the public space, but also sometimes in the private space, which has a little bit of an impact on where things would go. But I would agree with what Tara said.
I mean, the one thing I do wonder is, when it comes to specifically some, really critical or sectors that are getting a lot of interest at the moment, so things like AI, technology, semiconductors, etc. When it comes to these particular spaces, I do wonder how it's all going to play out, because, it would be that these sectors require so much capital investment that it would be a shame to duplicate efforts, and so it'll be interesting to see whether there are strategic alliances formed between countries when it comes to these particular spaces, or whether everyone just ends up, doubling up on all of these things.
Yeah.
I also want to ask you, are you seeing private equity firms look at the region? Because this has been a place where we've had certain challenges in the past, and I think a lot of the private equity firms would see the region as a source of capital rather than a place to invest. And again, Tara, are you beginning to see indications of private equity firms looking to deploy capital here?
Yeah, I'm sure May also has something to say about that. But no, look, absolutely. Obviously we've seen CVC very active in the region. We see Brookfield extremely active. You saw, General Atlantic on the, one of the panels yesterday saying they're going to increase investments in the Middle East. So I think there's a sense amongst those that have not spent. So firstly, there's pressure on all of these private equity firms to deploy some of the capital that they're raising in the region back into the region. Yeah. That's been the case for a few years now, right? Number one. Number two, I think there's a little bit of FOMO that is being felt by those that have not spent time in the region, because particularly in the last 3 years, the region has been very active, while the rest of the world has been, a little bit volatile or quieter at least. And so definitely, I think people are spending more time trying to understand the lay of the land and the landscape. I would say that the private equity firms that I think are more successful are the ones that actually have feet on the street and people on the ground that are practitioners from the region who understand the lay of the land, the regulatory landscape, the legalities around doing business here. And we've seen them be more effective and more active than, or successful around deal making than the kind of fly-in private equity model.
No, I fully agree with that. And I think going back to the point that Alison was making a bit earlier in terms of how quiet private equity has been globally, we've actually seen them more active than we've historically seen them in our region in terms of just the level of interest, the level of activity, the level of speed of movement, if you will, as well in terms of wanting to deploy. To Tara's point, those that have been more successful are the ones that have feet on the ground. But the other interesting part of it is the fact that the region sits, if you will, at at the crossroads between what's happening between the US and China. We're seeing more Chinese investment coming in, even through private equity, which ultimately then will invest. So for example, CIC announced $1 billion investment behind InvestCorp for a regional fund for them to deploy here. Other of the private equity firms, some of the ones that you mentioned, are actually issuing and establishing regional specific funds for them to invest in the region. And a lot of it is underpinned by the pressure points of the sovereign wealth fund saying, well, look, we want you, here's some money, yes, but we want you to also deploy them here. Apollo is an example of someone that did a joint venture with Aldar in looking at investments over here. And even just as recently as last week, we heard about the $5 billion investment that BlackRock is getting, and I spent a bit of time with BlackRock previously in deploying into infrastructure in the region. So there's all of this dynamic interplaying here that is showing us that we're going to see a lot more activity going forward.
Alison, just to talk very quickly about some of the sectors, I mean, the last private boom in 21 was kind of driven mostly by technology, healthcare, to think about more broadly. Are you seeing any change in that? I mean, are there any kind of upcoming sectors we're seeing a bit more activity than in the past?
We're seeing, we're seeing the same technology, healthcare so far. We're seeing a lot of activity in industrials, and we're beginning to see, I think, more activity in the FIG space than we had previously seen. That's obviously outside of the region where we've seen quite a lot. So, I think it's going to be pretty broad-based, to be honest with you. I think everybody's hoping that we're going to come back to a level of normal which is above where things are today. But we have, as I said, had a really great start to the beginning of this year. Really great start.
How much is like the pent-up activity? Like I had someone describe to me, it's almost like a tanker blocking the Suez Canal a few years back, that once the ship clears up, you're going to see a flurry of deals. Do you think we're going to be, as M&A journalists, kept busy to that level? I
think that analogy applies, in my view, to private equity assets.
Okay.
I think that's where the logjam is.
Yeah.
I don't think at the moment we're seeing corporates holding off doing things. So, there will be, as I said, we think there'll be this period of quiet, or less activity as you run up to the elections, and then hopefully we'll come back to something slightly more normalized than active beyond that. But I do think that there really is quite a lot of assets sitting in private equity hands that need to be sold. Yep. Now, some of them they can take a bit longer, but you've all seen those activities come down. I think there's an expectation that funds are going to start to come back before they're deployed, and therefore, to me, that is just an adjustment in expectations around valuation that need to happen for these deals to get done. It's not, in my mind, it's never that you can't get deals done. You can always get deals done. It's at what price, right? Yeah. And the environment needs to be one that's supportive for that. Yeah.
Alison mentioned, May, that some of the deals which have happened from, or at least attempted from this region has, surprised people. Are we going to, before we wind up, are you going to see more such transactions from Middle East? And what are your predictions? Are you going to see deals which will surprise people?
Is that a trick question? Depends on how you mean by surprise. I do think you have a very serious series of governments in our part of the world that are dead set on their agendas. And I do think that we're going to see them do bold things in order to deliver on those agendas. And those bold things would mean large transformational transactions that have the ability for it to come and serve that domestic agenda. And it can go across multitude of different industries, and it can be in multitude of different shapes. But fundamentally, it is about getting a lot more diversification sitting on the ground and a whole firepower behind the capital markets to grow and diversify and to attract more people to domicile themselves in the region. And the way you attract people is by having jobs. The way you have jobs is by having manufacturing or industry or consumer-led organizations. And certainly technology is a very big factor in all of that. So what you're seeing in terms of sets up some of these entities that you've spoke about and the new movements that we're seeing, it is all driven to help accelerate, as Tara said, the ability for them to do the investments that are necessary for that sure. ultimate goal to be achieved. So we will see a lot more, and the bolder the better, frankly, because that just allows for that whole diversification to happen sooner.